Your speech to this year's meeting of UNHCR's Executive Committee, it characterised the state of international refugee protection today by quoting the Italian political theorist Antonio Gramsci, who said, "The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, now is a time of monsters." What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, if you look at the situation that we have in so many countries around the world that are in conflict and crisis, and if you put yourselves into the shoes of people who are affected by them, well, for them what they live through on a daily basis is a monstrous situation. Think of the raging violent conflict in Syria. Think of what's happening in Afghanistan, in South Sudan. I'm wondering about the people in Aleppo, besieged, entrapped for years on end, not knowing whether they will ever have the basic necessities of life the next day, constantly threatened with aerial bombardment. So you can imagine for those people what they live through on a daily basis is monstrous. It's a monster, and we really hope that this is hopefully soon the past, and that's what we need to be striving for.
Given this situation, how concerned are you at the increase that we're seeing in xenophobia in some countries, the growing politicization of refugees and migrants in political debates, including in election campaigns and referendums?
What bothers me most is that refugees become the scapegoat. Refugees become the reason for elections to fail, for people to lose out in political short-term gains. It bothers me that refugees are considered a problem when actually refugees are people who flee problems. And they cannot, how can human beings ever be a problem? And that's what is so bothersome about the politics of today, that we do not necessarily see the leadership that is required to respond to the fears that is driving some of this, because fears is something one can deal with if one addresses it head on, deals with the realities of it.
This past year has seen a number of important advancements at the same time in refugee protection. You had the New York Declaration of September, the San Jose Agreement or the Action Plan on dealing with gang violence in Central America, the COP21 Climate Change Agreement, a whole bunch of, if you like, key developments that have advanced in many ways the protection environment. Why do you think it is that despite this, the public discourse at the moment is tending still to be negative?
It's interesting that whenever there is a situation that is sort of a crisis, that there are also very positive forces that come together. What we have experienced over the last year is actually a revival of multilateralism. At the same time, we see also those who turn into narrowness, isolationism, and inwardness. There are these strange dichotomies that we face and paradoxes that we have. I wonder whether political leadership needs to own up to that challenge much more. And it's interesting, President Obama, during the Leaders Summit in New York, there was one thing that really struck me and that was so strong about politics, because politics at the end of the day is the means to address the fears of people, to deal with communities, to listen to them, to find out what can be done. He said, let us not forget those of us who have chosen to go into politics, and when we climb up the ladder of power, that we actually do that for the sake of a better world, for the sake of making the life of people better. And that was very impressive, because that's what politics has to achieve.
Well, in that context, you have mentioned the need for a strengthened social contract between refugees and the societies they live in. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
What does it mean? It means that there is a bond between the people who live on a territory and the state. And the state has to do certain things for the people who live in that state to become happy and prosperous and to advance and progress. So the state has to provide the enabling environment for that social interaction to happen, which means on employment, for example, the state needs to make sure that people, refugees, can have access to the labor market, that they can go to school, that refugee children can go to school, that young adolescent refugees are listened to and that we take very seriously what they say. And also that they are able to reunite with their family members.
One of the developments that's become increasingly apparent in 2016 and in the last few years is that for many refugees they're staying longer and longer as refugees. The traditional solutions of voluntary repatriation, local integration or resettlement aren't delivering on the numbers of people there are in need of solutions. What needs to change?
First of all, it is important to make sure that this is seen as a priority to be addressed at the international community level. And we have seen this through the New York Declaration. The New York Declaration helps us amplify partnerships with the private sector, with the World Bank, with international financial institutions, with partners that we have never even been engaged with. So that's very important because it shows that there can be a win-win situation in a number of countries. We heard from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, for example, at the summit meeting in New York, that they are willing to give employment opportunities to refugees because they also benefit the local communities. We see that access to education will become a reality for many more children because, of course, the data, if you look at the data for refugee children in terms of access to education, they fall far below the global average. Only half of refugee children can access primary education. Only 1 out of 4 children can go to secondary education. Only 1% of refugees have access to tertiary education. So obviously a lot more needs to be done to support them. We have seen a lot more initiatives over the last year, a lot more funding that is made available to actually close that gap. And with the private sector involvement, we have seen more employers coming forward and saying, yes, we actually think that refugees are wonderful employees because they have a can-do attitude. They have an attitude, they want to succeed, they want to prove themselves. They have an entrepreneurial spirit. And as a result of this is what changes. That's where the sea change is happening, with more understanding by much broader parts of all of us, what and how we can engage with people who are displaced.
Voluntary repatriation, local integration, resettlement, they're the traditional solutions for refugees. But increasingly people who are becoming displaced are spending years on end displaced. What has to change to address this?
It's very important to look at the current situation, bearing in mind that these realities will stay with us. At the same time, I think it's also important not to over-dramatize situations. Especially in the industrialized world, we do not have massive numbers of people coming to the industrialized world. The bulk of refugees and internal displacement issues are in the global south. So we do need to support those economies, those social structures, that they can actually deal with often very, very difficult situations because infrastructure is overwhelmed, local authorities are overwhelmed. But if they get a little bit of support, they can actually deal with it, including the communities. But they just need that support and they need a recognition of that. And that, I think, has changed. There's a much broader spectrum of partnerships that have arisen over the last 2 years or so that we have discovered. The financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Labour Organization, for example, they have been much more engaged with us on ensuring that refugees can have access to employment. And we need to build and forge these new partnerships in this much broader, more holistic approach to displacement issues.